I'm with Lia Ernst, Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU of Vermont, as well as a longtime board member of NEFAC. With protests against racism and police brutality occurring throughout the country, Lia is going to help us understand what kind of protections we have under the First Amendment, whether you're participating in a demonstration or rally or working as a member of the press and covering one. So Lia, there's no shortage of videos showing protesters out gathered in public spaces, largely demonstrating peacefully, yet in some of those cases, they're still being approached by police officers, told to disperse the areas that they're in, and in many cases arrested as well. So why don't we start with the most fundamental question? Does the First Amendment protect our right to protest, and why?
Oh, absolutely it does. The First Amendment contains three separate provisions that all relate to the right to protest. You've got the freedom of speech, the right to peacefully assemble, and the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. So taken together, these all establish a core of protections that directly implicate the right to protest. And the reason that's so important is that the right to join with your fellow citizens in protest or peaceful assembly is absolutely critical to the functioning democracy.
But we all know that under the First Amendment, there are the words peaceably assemble. What does that look like in real day terms, given these circumstances? Under the law, under the First Amendment, which is law, what is considered a peaceful assembly?
You know, the easiest way to think about what is a peaceful assembly is to think about what it is not. A peaceful assembly is one in which there is not a clear and present danger of riot, disorder, interference with traffic on public streets, or some other immediate threat to the public safety or order. Absent one of those conditions, you're in a peaceful assembly.
Okay, so are there any circumstances then that would allow a police officer to legally break up a group of peaceful demonstrators or to arrest a nonviolent protester?
Sure. So as an initial matter, breaking up a peaceful assembly should always be a last resort. But if a peaceful protest does violate a lawful directive, officers can address that. So just to make it a little more concrete, perhaps, we're seeing around the country a lot of cities impose curfews. No one's allowed on the street after 9 p.m. or whatever the case may be. And curfews in and of themselves pose real tough constitutional questions, because we do have the right to move about the world, and being told to remain at home is a direct contravention of that right. And so when you see a curfew, it can only be justified if it's absolutely limited to the part of the city in question where there is an imminent threat of danger and harm. Oftentimes they're broad and vague, which invites discriminatory or arbitrary enforcement. And they must be limited in time to what is absolutely necessary to prevent what is, a real and direct threat. So assuming all these criteria are met, police officers can lawfully disperse a protest once the curfew sets in. But in doing so, they should always seek voluntary compliance first. And even ask the question, is it necessary to disperse this protest even though the curfew has set in? If people are still being entirely peaceful, an officer can exercise discretion to not disperse the protest. If there's some other problem with the protest, say they're blocking street or pedestrian traffic, the officer should just ask them to move off, to where they're not causing that harm, rather than breaking up the protest altogether.
So considering all of that, Lia, if a protester were to be approached by a police officer, even if they were faced with an unlawful arrest, do you have any suggestions on how they could best respond?
Sure. So first of all, it should never be the responsibility of the public to de-escalate the police. It's the police's job not to escalate a situation and to de-escalate where possible. But that being said, there are some things you can do to minimize the risk of personal and possibly serious harm. And so we encourage people to remain calm, keep their hands visible. If you're not sure whether you're being detained, you should always ask if you are free to leave. And if so, you just calmly walk away. Many police encounters are not arrests and they're not detentions, and you have every right to simply end the encounter and go on your way. So always determine, what is the nature of the interaction you're having with the police officer. If in fact you are being arrested, certainly, never physically resist arrest, even if it's an unlawful one. The time for asserting that the arrest was unlawful is unfortunately later, not in the actual instance. We encourage people to ask the officer why they are being arrested, and otherwise stay silent. Don't submit to questioning without a lawyer. Don't sign any statements or other documents without a lawyer. We encourage people not to give consent to be searched. They likely will be searched if they are arrested, but if you consent, it's much harder to challenge that search later in court. And finally, when you can, we encourage people to make a very detailed record of everything that happened. And that includes such things as the officer's name, badge number, patrol car number. If there were any witnesses that could corroborate your account, write down everything that happened to the best of your recollection as soon as possible before those details start to slip away. So that if your rights were violated, you have the material necessary to establish that in court.
Great, thank you. Switching topics a little bit, as we mentioned, there are a number of recordings and videos being taken of interaction between protesters and police. Can you explain to us what rights we may have as citizens, not necessarily members of the press, but citizens, everyone? What rights do we have to record police activity?
Sure. So the First Amendment absolutely does protect your right to record so long as you're lawfully in a public place and you're recording that which is in plain view. So that would certainly include police officers making arrests or, firing tear gas on protesters or whatever the case may be. The police can ask you to stop what you're doing if you are actually interfering with their legitimate work, but otherwise you're free to film them in action.
Can the police ever confiscate our cameras, or if we are under arrest and those cameras are confiscated, do the police have the right to delete any of the material that we may have recorded?
No, so police generally must have a warrant to confiscate a cell phone or a camera, any other device. They cannot demand that you show them what you've recorded. And under no circumstances may they delete anything from your device. So even though those are the rights and protections, we also do advise folks to disable, face recognition ID or thumb ID from their devices so that the police officers can't open the devices just by, holding them up to your face or your finger. As you mentioned, if they are arresting you, they will confiscate your phone along with the rest of your belongings and hold on to them until you're released. But again, they cannot search your phone without a warrant.
Okay, and what about journalists in particular? Are there any special protections that the First Amendment provides to reporters that are out covering these protests?
So just as protesters have a fundamental First Amendment right to protest, journalists have a fundamental First Amendment right to cover those protests. Where those rights might differ in application at times is that orders such as curfews, for example, typically make exceptions for reporters. And that's, in recognition of their essential role in informing the public what the government is up to in their name. And in almost no circumstances is an order lawful that would seek to prohibit a journalist from publishing or reporting on what they saw.
Do you have any specific suggestions for reporters that are out covering these events and are approached by law enforcement officers, riot police, and told to leave a particular area?
Yeah, a lot of the same suggestions that apply in general. We discussed before about if you're approached by police apply equally to reporters. But in addition, you would want to express very clearly and repeatedly that you are media, have your credentials readily available and visible. If there's a curfew that accepts reporters, try to have a printed copy of that order so that you can point to the exception. Also keep your recorder or camera running if possible so that you can document what may be an unlawful arrest. And again, although we have all these rights and protections, unfortunately what we've seen over the past several days and over the past several decades is journalists who are doing all of these things have nevertheless been subject to tear gassing, being shoved to the ground, being arrested, or far worse. And so I would just encourage everybody to be safe, to hold true and hold tight to their rights that are fundamental to them by virtue of being here in the United States, but also make sure that when all is said and done, we're not just letting these egregious violations go unnoticed and unaccounted for.
Thank you, Leah. This is no doubt a very difficult time. We at NEFAC, we're continuing to push for transparency within law enforcement, looking for ways to hold police officers accountable for their actions, as well as protecting everyone's First Amendment rights, all 5 of those freedoms, because even during a pandemic, our constitutional rights must be respected. So thank you for all the work that you're doing, and thank you for serving on behalf of NEFAC. I would encourage anyone within New England who feels that their First Amendment rights have been violated in some way to either contact me personally at justin@nefac.org or to contact your local ACLU chapter. Leah, thank you again.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you for all that NEFAC does.